Hello, my name is W.J. Sheehan. I am the author of a series of books entitled Bigfoot Terror in the Woods, Sightings and Encounters. The series is a compilation of sightings, encounters, and evidential findings pertaining to Bigfoot in North America. It is available in both paperback and ebook formats by going to www.buybigfootbooks.com, and the link will take you where you want to go. Both now as well as going into the future, I will be reading various chapters from the series and posting them for your listening pleasure. If you have seen something, say something. I can be contacted at splinters@optonline.net. That's SPLINTERS at OPTonline.net. Today's reading is entitled The Fight, and it comes from Volume 2 of my series, Bigfoot Terror in the Woods, Sightings and Encounters. I hope you enjoy it. This story came to me by way of Brian Mahoney from Fargo, North Dakota. Here is Brian's tale as it was conveyed to me. I had been long tired of seeing the TV shows with people banging on logs and trees and never seeing anything when I ran across your query and decided to take you where the action is. In 1967, my dad and 3 other men in the neighborhood took me and 4 other boys on a trip up to Ontario to fish muskies. We found ourselves landing at Perot Falls Airport, where we met up with a couple of float planes that ferried us up to a place near Ear Falls. My only memory was that we had rented a pretty big cabin for the week with plenty of room for all of us to rough it. But heck, we didn't care at that time if we slept in the woods. We were up in the sticks, landing on water in a seaplane, and we were going muskie fishing. The dads had hired a guide whose name was Lars, and we had 3 boats for the group. The boats were pretty big, something like 18 or 20 feet, and they had plenty of power to get us around in a hurry. Several days into the trip, we had been into the fish hot and heavy every day, just as advertised. We were landing muskies in the range of 28 to 36 inches on a regular basis and having a ball. The fight of these fish pound for pound is outrageous if you've never caught them. Most of the shoreline that we were fishing had forest coming right down to the water's edge, but periodically there was an area of bank with no trees that was visible along the shore. We had been fishing every day facing the shore and pretty close to it. It must have been about 4 p.m. when we heard a loud and long roar coming from out in the woods. We all looked at each other and asked Lars, "What the hell is that?" He said that it sounded like a large grizzly bear. It was only 2 minutes after we heard the first roar that another one sounded off, coming from the opposite direction in the woods. There must be either 2 of them or one very fast runner. Over the next 15 minutes or so, as we sat fishing the bank, we heard several more roars. It seemed like they were being made back and forth by 2 different bears. At least that's what we thought at the time. Now, before I continue, I have to set you up visually for what was about to happen. We were sitting in 3 boats, spaced maybe 150 feet apart. All of these boats were about 100 feet from the shore, facing one of these slopes on the bank that I told you about. The water we were fishing was approximately 6 feet deep, and the bottom was covered with grasses that these muskies hung around in. We were all looking at each other from boat to boat as we listened to these roars, which sounded like they were getting closer and closer to our position. I don't know why, but I felt like a fuse had been lit and a bomb was about to explode. And explode it did. Suddenly, the woods directly in front of us erupted in what I can only describe as a lion fight. The volume and intensity of the roaring was so loud that it hurt my ears. I couldn't see what was making the noise. I looked at the other boats to my right, and Lars was already waving to start the motors. As we started the engines, we were now all motoring further away from the shoreline, but everyone was still looking back at the trees. The roars almost drowned out the sound of our engines at times. We switched into neutral, and all the boats were now about 300 feet from the shore facing the woods. It was so intense that I was trembling. I could now make out two large dark figures engaging in an apparent battle for supremacy just inside of the tree line. The roaring was unrelenting as the struggle ensued within the trees. At one point, I almost felt as though I was going to faint. I really can't find the words to describe my emotions. Right at a time when I thought that things couldn't possibly get any worse, these two giant black beasts came tumbling out of the trees, rolling down the embankment, smacking and biting each other. Both of the beasts were now in the water, and every time one started to stand, the other would slap it, and they would grapple, smashing each other into the water. Each time one bit the other, the screams of pain were even louder than when they had been apart. I remember thinking that I wanted to stop watching and listening, but I couldn't. I could tell that one of the beasts was starting to get the better of the other, and finally, with one titanic blow, the creature's body buckled to the ground, and it lay there, unmoving. The victor stood leering over the other, growling ever more intensely and pounding its chest. It reminded me of when King Kong beat the dinosaur. I thought the downed beast was dead. It lay half in the water and half out, face down and not moving. Then the other beast turned to face us, and raising its head into the air, letting out what sounded like a half roar and half scream, as it pumped its fists and flexed its upper body. It then turned to the victim and stood over it, roaring over and over again. A few moments later, it walked up the bank, roaring and screaming into the woods. Everyone in the boats was shell-shocked, and our mouths hung open. Some of the guys were holding their heads like they were losing their minds, and none of us could speak. I saw the beast that was lying in the water lift its arm and drop it, like it was its last gasp. We motored away and headed back to the lodge for the evening. Now, I won't get into all of the conversation and whatnot that went on that night, because there is so much more to tell you about these beasts. I had never heard a grizzly bear in my life, but when Lars said the roars had sounded like a big grizzly, something had said to me that it wasn't true. Up until that point in my life, I had never heard anything living make a sound that loud. It was as intense as a diesel train's whistle. Had it been closer, it may have broken our eardrums. And when they were fighting in front of us, some of the other guys actually had their hands to their ears. The oars that were laying in the aluminum boat seats were vibrating loudly. Another thing was the fight itself. At no time during the fight did they hit each other with a closed fist. They were slapping each other open-handed, grappling and biting. It seemed to me that the biting was used to get an advantage during what appeared to be a wrestling match of mammoth proportions. The fight had been so intense that I couldn't understand how either of them could withstand another second before one of them had dropped. Lars went back to the scene the next day, and the one in the water was gone, so maybe it had survived, but we will never know. When they were slapping and thrashing each other around in the water, the waves which they were creating were rocking our boat far offshore. They were incredibly large, and when their mouths were open and roaring, in particular the one that in the end was looking at us while roaring, I could see huge white teeth, and it looked like a bowling ball could fit into the mouth with no problem. The two of them had to be in excess of 10 feet tall and maybe 2,000 pounds. When they were slamming each other against the ground, I could feel the reverberations out in the water, and you could hear the hit. This had to be some type of animalistic fight for territory or domination of the females. It was like they were calling each other to the duel, and neither was going to back down. In my opinion, these are vicious and bloodthirsty wild beasts, and they are not to be trifled with. But there are people walking around in the woods with no guns who must be out of their minds, thinking they are going to visit Mr. Happy of the forest. One of these monsters could easily take a full-grown man and throw him into orbit. This type of physical strength and force is something that we know nothing about, and quite possibly never will. Thank you for listening.